Oh,
Yes, they are.
perfect. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about our work into the extent to which you can measure culture in policing. It's been an extremely interesting piece of work to do, and certainly has been quite formative in terms of my own thinking about culture in policing organisations. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about the background of this work, and then I'll move on just to take you through some of the primary findings from it and what we see as the future research questions that maybe this network and certainly myself will be exploring over the next few years. So the background to this work then, so it all started with the National Policing Culture and Inclusion Strategy 2025 to 2023. And this really brought together that network-wide need to look at how culture can be evaluated within policing organisations and the potential for cultural change as part of that. But when we're talking about cultural change, when we talk about change in any respect, you need a baseline and you need some way of charting how things develop over time as a result of whatever interventions you put in place. And that's really what sparked this potential interest in, can culture actually be measured? And if we're going to measure culture, or if we're going to try to measure culture, how do we go about doing so? And that's really quite implicit within the cultural inclusion strategy, because it talks about dashboards, it talks about frameworks, it talks about monitoring, as you can see in that quote that I've drawn from the strategy here. So that's what sparked this particular Agile evidence review. And that's something that we progressed through a literature review. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is we didn't go out and do primary research. It's all based on academic reviews of existing paper through structured searching within primarily Web of Science and other databases, and then snowballing from there. So really to understand as much as possible about measuring culture, not just in policing organisations, but in organisations in general, to understand what we could then transfer potentially into the policing context. But I should note at the outset, and certainly what I came across very, very early on, is the moment you start talking about cultural measurement, you get into quite a contentious situation with academics, and a lot of debate as to whether it is actually possible to measure culture. And that's some of what I'll touch upon today. But before I go any further, I think just wanted to reminder for anyone who's not read the whole report yet, these were the 3 questions that the Agile Evidence Review sought to answer. So in what ways could organizational culture be measured, and what are the strengths and weaknesses of the individual approaches? And there are a lot of them. Are there other ways of assessing organizational culture? So primarily in that qualitative space. And then that critical one, are measures of culture actually effective ways of informing and tracking cultural change? So I'll take each one in turn now as we go through the presentation. But I want to start with just a brief overview of what culture actually is as a starting point for our discussion today. As with many things, certainly in the academic space, there is no agreed definition of what constitutes culture in organizations. It's generally accepted that it is the deeply held values, assumptions, and beliefs held by the membership of a group. And that really manifests on a day-to-day in the way things are done, or the way things are done in an organization, the decisions, the beliefs, the way people talk to one another. And this culture or cultures results from this shared history of the group, the experiences, the policies, everything that group has been through and endured over time. And it's passed on to successive generations of employees, for example, via their socialization into the culture. But there's or is about. Culture is not monolithic within organizations. If you were to walk into any police force or any organization today, you would notice that whilst there is cohesive elements that represent perhaps that wider organization, there is inevitably going to be subcultures, whether those exist at a departmental or team levels, and that those subcultures represent facets of that wider culture, but they also have their own individual elements. And so perhaps it's more now accepted to look at organizations as not as a monolithic singular culture, but actually comprising multiple levels and layers of different subcultures, which I think you're probably already beginning to see. Well, if we've got all these different layers and subcultures, how do we measure all of this? And that's something I'll come back to later. What we also know about culture, and another layer of complexity I've had to add, is that there are facets of culture which are distinctly occupational, so derived from the distinct experiences or context of particular occupations. But there are also organizational cultures which derive from the organization. I think that's probably an explanation for the fact that, certainly from my experience in working in different police forces, is that all forces have a common, perhaps, or the majority of forces have a common feel to them, derived from the fact that they are police forces. They have that police occupational culture. But there are also variations derived from the distinct characteristics of that individual force. Yet when we think about policing, despite all this complexity, it's important to note that there are perhaps, or there are certainly recognised in the literature, some commonalities that arise. And certainly in the popular press, there is a real, or perhaps a greater emphasis on the negatives dimensions of this. But those commonalities include communication, comradeship, categorization, compassion, cynicism, and they can all have positive and negative aspects. So we're beginning to see now how complex culture is. But then if we think about how we analyze culture from the outside looking in, there are different lenses with which we can do so. So from one perspective, there can be what we call the functionalist view, where culture is viewed as something that can be measured, or it is visible, it can be categorized and quantified. An alternative perspective is a more subjectivist view, one that views culture as the organization, deeply embedded, almost as a metaphor for what that organization is. So it's rich, it's multi-layered, and in that respect, potentially resistant to being evaluated. So having set that scene with quite a bit of complexity there about what culture actually is in general and in policing organizations, I'll now talk about some of the quantitative instruments that we looked at for measuring culture. I'm not going to go into any one of these specifically, but I've included some examples there on the screen for you. What we found when I looked at quantitative instruments was there was a lot of variation there. Just as there is no single accepted definition for culture, there's no single accepted measurement or measuring practice for it either. Some of the instruments we looked at were designed to be delivered as a one-off, perhaps, or as a diagnostic tool, or even as a diagnostic tool allied to specific innovation or interventions aimed at changing the diagnosis of that culture into one which fitted a particular model. But we did find that the majority of quantitative instruments were surveys in nature. There were a few which used very highly structured interview formats, but the majority were survey or questionnaire. And these offered some quite distinct advantages. A questionnaire can be delivered at scale, can be delivered quite rapidly at scale. It affords psychological safety for the recipients because it can be completed anonymously. And it has the ability for replication. So the same survey can be conducted over time and results compared. But with this comes some quite notable limitations. Going back to when I spoke about culture a few minutes ago, with culture as complex, multifaceted, and rich in nature, that level of insight is very, very difficult to draw out using a questionnaire, particularly a questionnaire that is highly structured and without free text elements, for example. There is also the challenge with questionnaires, and certainly some of those instruments I've listed there on the slide, is that they are generic in that they were designed, a lot of them were designed for big business. And so their applicability to the public sector and their applicability to policing is potentially contested. These questionnaires also are to a lesser or greater degree, I won't say questionable in the extent to which they really surface what culture is, as opposed to perhaps assessing or evaluating some more superficial elements. And or some of the instruments we looked at will have a very specific focus on one dimension of culture, which if we go back to that previous definition of culture as multifaceted, multi-layered and complex, you can begin to see how if we're only looking at one dimension, there are potentially challenges in tracking change, but also getting that holistic view, which certainly from my perspective is perhaps what the National Policing Strategy is hinting at. What was quite noticeable though, was that when I began to look at these instruments, there are a large number that have been designed for healthcare settings. When I compared that to policing, I noticed a real shift, certainly amongst academic community, towards qualitative measures of culture. So I'll go on to those now. Qualitative measures of examining organizational culture focus on artifacts, behaviors, practice, methods including semi-structured interviews, unstructured interviews, workshops. There's a whole range. And very often these are brought together in multi-method formats to get a really rich and deep insight into what culture looks like in an organization. But the challenge with this is that results in a large volume of data for analysis. So it can be extremely resource intensive. And whilst there is that ability to explore nuance via cultural means, or via, qualitative means, as with any qualitative research, there is always the challenge of the potential or the researcher's positionality. So the extent to which the researcher's, I want to say bias or interpretation colors the findings. Further, if we're thinking certainly about that culture strategy and that emphasis on creating dashboards and tracking change over time, that lack of replicability really mediates against the use of the qualitative methods, because you're never going, or you're very unlikely to be able to meaningfully track change through this method, these processes. So those were the first two questions that we looked at in the Agile evidence review. But at that point, began to think about, well, if we're not going to look at qualitative and quantitative methods individually are not really giving us what we want, what about mixed methods? Bringing together the advantages and the disadvantages of qualitative and quantitative to cancel one another out and take a multi-layer, multi-level perspective on culture. And absolutely, there are some real opportunities there. But I think that challenge with mixed methods comes back to resource. Having that time, the leeway, and certainly for outside researchers, outside of policing, being able to gain that level of access and trust in an organization to conduct that degree of research. So I think what I've presented so far is a largely negative picture. But there is hope, I promise. And that's where I'd like to introduce the concept of organizational climate, which was slightly outside of the Agile evidence review, but actually in coming across it and exploring it further, I think offers some real opportunities as a more readily accessible means of assessing organizational culture or organizations as part of their development. Excuse that slip of the language there. So culture and climate are distinct phenomenons. They're connected, but fundamentally different. When we talk about culture, we're talking about fundamental values, belief systems going right into the heart of the behavior of the organization. And then because it's so deeply ingrained, the extent to which it is actually amenable to change is debatable. In contrast, climate is generally more superficial. It's the attitudes and behaviors that you see on day-to-day in an organization, associated with shared perceptions, but potentially much more malleable and much more flexible in terms of change. And studies around culture and climate have demonstrated that actually the way in which employees go about their work and interact on a day-to-day basis is influenced significantly by climate. And so therefore thinking about interventions and change, we've got some opportunities here. So climate includes all of those aspects, such as conflict and ambiguity management. It's the ways in which friendliness manifests in an organization. It's the way in which individuals view their roles as to its importance and variety. It's the interactions and support of leadership on a daily basis. It's that professional and organizational esprit de corps and the trust within the organization. So whereas culture may be more challenging for us to look at, the climate is potentially more observable. It's certainly potentially more amenable to surfacing through quantitative means and qualitative means. It's the type of thing that I'm not going to say definitely can assess via staff surveys, but it's certainly more serviceable via those all those regular feedback and engagement mechanisms that we have within our police forces. So in practice, I'm proposing that climate is potentially an alternative way of looking at policing organizational behavior that we may, as a community, wish to consider. Which brings me to the third question, that third of the Agile evidence review. Are measures of culture effective in informing and tracking cultural change? And in a word, I'm going to say unlikely. And I'll explain why I've come to that view. Organizational culture, as we've seen today, is complex. There are different views on what it constitutes, whether you have that functionalist view that is something that could be measured, observed, monitored over time, that's receptive to change, or whether your view is more actually, it is extremely subjective, it is deeply ingrained within the organizational psyche and behavior. And so part of what that organization is in practice, and therefore less amenable to change. What we've also seen is that culture is multi-leveled or multi-layered, in that the culture that you have one say element of the hierarchy may not reflect the culture in other layers. If we add into that the difference between perhaps a management level culture and a practitioner level culture, we've got the individual cultures of teams, departments, those subcultures. We can add into that fact that we might have an organization with an extremely healthy culture, very positive, where justice and all of those values thrive. But even within that utopian culture, there may be pockets of very poor culture. So you can see there's some real challenges with actually unpicking what it is we're going to measure, and using a single means or a single method to assess that is going to be extremely difficult. We can add into that complexity the fact that actually culture is largely intangible. And so whoever goes in to research it will have the challenge of their own perceptions, putting their own perception onto it and their own interpretation. Added to that is that actually if we're doing work around culture, that requires a high degree of psychological safety amongst the individuals who are engaging in focus groups or engaging in interviews. And that's something that I think was really brought home to me in a separate piece of research, in that if that psychological safety isn't present in an organization, then trying to do focus group research just won't work. And so you can see here there are so many different dimensions that we need to think about when we talk about culture. And that really is what led me to that, I guess, my central argument of today is that measures of culture are unlikely to be effective tools in informing and tracking cultural change. But that's not the end of the story. It's never the end of the story, because there are still, I believe, some fundamental opportunities for academia and policing to work together in looking at how we can think about culture in policing and how perhaps we can work to surface some of those cultural elements. Primarily, I would say as an outset, looking to break culture down. So it's really tempting to start with a big research question, like, I want to know about culture in this force. But perhaps if we take a step back and think about how can we look at discrete manifestations of culture in policing, whether we want to look at comradeship or cynicism or trust. So just maybe being a little less ambitious in scope, but going much deeper in depth. Also, I think you probably guessed, I see climate as a real opportunity for how we look at culture in policing organisations and an opportunity for future research. So in this vein, I've proposed here just a couple of different research questions that policing academia might want to consider over the next few years in this sector. Particularly, the big one for me to highlight is that fourth one, and the impact of police reform is the big challenge on the horizon. So today I've spoken to you about quantitative measures of culture and their potential to surface discrete elements at a high level, offering advantages of replicability and scale, but with that big challenge of being able to explore depth and nuance and variation in culture. We've looked at the qualitative means, that ability to gather rich data that casts an insight on interactions, behaviors, beliefs, and values, but the challenge being that lack of replicability and resource. And we've looked at whether measures of culture are effective for tracking change, and presented the argument that this is unlikely to be a pathway or a valid pathway of further work. But what I want to close with is just a reflection on culture. It is complex. It is challenging to define, extremely intangible. It doesn't have that physical form because it exists in the interactions between people and the interactions with their organizational environment. And these create substantial barriers to tracking culture in a linear fashion for change. But also, I guess for practitioners out there, I just want to highlight that culture is only one piece of the puzzle that makes up your organizations, and that culture is important, but changing the culture won't change every challenge or won't solve all the problems organizations face. And that's because there's still a lot of debate as to the degree to which culture actually influences the behavior of individuals on a day-to-day basis. Coupled with that is always the uncertainty. So if we're putting in interventions around cultural change, because it's so complex, you can never guarantee what will happen as a result. So really what I'm calling for here is further research, further exploration and understanding as to how we can explore culture and how, or if or how there is potential to shape change for the future. So I'll close there, and thank you for listening.
Thanks ever so much, Naomi. I'm going to end the recording now. And as I said, that will be available on our website later. So 1 second.